Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the ANAB webinar, ISO Accreditation Explained, Decrypting the Global Recognition System for Accreditation. I'm your facilitator, David Feist. Warren, you have control. Can you advance the slide one page? Thank you. The logistics that we have is that as you enter into this webinar, all attendees are muted. You will have the ability to submit any questions in the Q&A box. Please feel free to do so. We will pass those along to our presenter, Warren Merkel. Warren, can you advance one page? We'd like to tell you a little bit about Warren. We're very fortunate to have him as our presenter today. Warren is the ANAB Vice President of Policy. He's been with us a number of months. He previously was at NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, as the Chief of Standards Services, advising government agencies on standards and conformity assessment. As such, he is uniquely positioned to discuss this subject, and he is the co-convener of the revisions of ISO 17025 and ISO 17060. All right, so I welcome our presenter, Warren. Please proceed.
Thanks so much, David. I appreciate the introduction, and I appreciate that we have so many participants here today. I'm really looking forward to talking to all of you about this system that's evolved over time to address the needs for recognizing accreditation and conformity assessment. So I have a couple objectives here, and I think it will be helpful to set the stage because I'm guessing that many of the attendees come from different levels of understanding of these standards. So I'm going to start by providing a little context on how this system developed and evolved and what factors in the world, both at the national and international level, really determined how these tools came to be and then evolved into the way they're used today and will continue to evolve. We'll talk a lot about the standards that are used for conformity assessment, just placing them in the right context and giving you some examples of how they fit into this overall system. I'll describe the roles of regional and global organizations that recognize accreditation bodies and facilitate acceptance of results from conformity assessment bodies, and how those layers of the system function and interact and affect each other as you move from the conformity assessment body all the way through to these global systems. Now, there's a lot of detail beneath this in the time that we have. If you are really interested in the very specific nature of a given area of accreditation or one of the regional organizations or the standards involved, please, as David said, put your question in the Q&A. And of course, if you have questions that we can't answer today, we'll follow up in the future. So I want to start with a little history timeline here. I'm guessing we have metrologists in this webinar, so I recognize this is the PowerPoint version of the timeline. It is not to scale, especially given that a lot of things happen in a relatively compressed time. But I'll start because it was in the title of this webinar, ISO, the International Organization for Standardization, which was established in 1947. So if you think about the events that had happened just previous to that, there was a recognition that if the world is going to move forward in commerce and interaction, then having standards that can be applied across the globe would be really useful. But starting in 1947 till now, ISO itself doesn't do any conformity assessment. They don't accredit, they don't certify, they don't test. And so that's one of the elements of this system that we'll try and unpack as we go through the rest of the webinar. 1970, ISO established Certico, which is, there was a long time ago, and the records that I found were not clear, but I'm assuming that meant the Committee on Certification. So if you have standards, somebody's going to be looking at whether those standards are met. And as products were moving around the world, there was an interest in what these certifications meant, what these marks meant. It's also a very important year because that's the year I was born. And that has some bearing on this because if you look at the timeline, I was getting into accreditation just at the time that this all started in the late, the early 90s. In 1977, a conference of accreditation bodies for laboratories was started that began trying to harmonize approaches for accrediting laboratories across the world. And that's evolved into the organization, one of the organizations that still exists today. In 1985, Certica, which was focused on certification, expanded its scope within CASCO to become the Committee for Conformity Assessment. And again, all of this happened before the mid 80s. This was very early on in the globalization, of, in some ways pre-globalization, which was often marked by a couple of things that happened in the next few boxes. The formation of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation in 1993, the European Single Market, and at that time also a forum for international accreditation related to certification was formed. In 1995, the World Trade Organization was established, including its agreement on technical barriers to trade. And as this progress was made from standards through to paying attention to certification and accreditation, conformity assessment, in 2000, so 23 years ago, there were global arrangements established among accreditation bodies. The reason I want to touch on this first is a lot of this had to do with the free flow of products among markets. And so you have standards to define the characteristics. Somebody's determining those standards are met, but it's really important to then know that you can trust the results, whether it's a certification or a test or an inspection or a credential that's given to an individual. And so there's a long history of this, and it was cumulative. There was no grand plan to establish a global system for accreditation recognition. It just evolved to meet the needs as the world economies advanced and as there were new applications for these standards and practices. Along the way, we're really good in accreditation, like many industries, at establishing acronyms for the standards organizations like ISO, or ANAB, or all of the other organizations involved in this. And there are lots and lots of standards. ISO publishes thousands of standards, and we're only really going to focus on a subset of those standards as we talk about accreditation and that system. But regardless of all of the acronyms, all of the systems that have been established, the key to all of what we do in accreditation and these global recognition processes is to ensure that stakeholders can have confidence that if they need a standard to be met, they can trust the outcomes and information that are provided to demonstrate that conformity with the requirements that they need. And so as this evolution that I talked about through the development of these different organizations and processes, globalization came along and drove really the need for that confidence, not just to be at the local level or the national level or even the regional level. It now has to be trusted across borders. And that kind of global trust took time, decades of interaction among all of the different stakeholders and establishing all of the requirements and practices that we'll talk about today. But as these processes evolved, it became complicated with layers. And so in each layer, I'll break down the role and function of each of the types of organization and what functions they accomplish through that process. Now, there's some terminology that's specific to conformity assessment in this space, and I want to make sure that these terms are defined here a little bit based on the ISO IEC 17000 terminology, conformity assessment terminology document. So we're going to start at the basis for this. A specified requirement is just a need or expectation that's stated. So if you are manufacturing a product, there may be specified requirements in a standard, multiple standards, or some other document that you have in your organization. But at the core of conformity assessment, all the way through to the global recognition, are these specified requirements. If you're more interested in how that conformity assessment process works, I recommend looking at last month's webinar on conformity assessment that is on our website. The recording is there. So conformity assessment is just demonstrating that those requirements are fulfilled. And so in the terminology that we're using, within the structure that we're going to talk about, that conformity assessment could be testing, inspection, validation or verification, certification of products, persons, management systems, or accreditation. And so we'll talk about how all of those different pieces fit together. The object of conformity assessment is the entity that those specified requirements apply to. And so as I mentioned, the conformity assessment can be performed on a range of different entities. It could be a product, a process, a person, a system, an installation, or any combination of the items that are listed on the screen. The point here is that there are specified requirements. Those requirements apply to this object, and some organization, some entity, some person is going to determine that those requirements are met. That entity is a conformity assessment body unless it's performing accreditation. Accreditation body is a special organization within this structure because it's got an authority to perform accreditation and determine the competence of conformity assessment bodies. There are different ways to determine that requirements are met. If those requirements are being assessed by peers within a system, then that's called peer assessment. And I'm planting that seed because that's how accreditation bodies evaluate each other. Recognition is the acknowledgement of the validity of conformity assessment results. So you're recognizing the output of a conformity assessment body or an accreditation body. And then finally, the last term that comes up throughout the webinar is a multilateral arrangement. And again, it's where two or more parties recognize each other's or accept each other's conformity assessment results. Now, I know we're already diving right into the language of this code that I'm supposed to be decrypting. And so I just wanted to make sure that we're coming from the same place with the terminology, and I'll refer back to these terms as we go through the rest of the webinar. There's an object, it's got requirements. A conformity assessment body is doing determination that those requirements are met and may also be doing some attestation to the market or to customers about that conformity. An accreditation body can look at the conformity assessment body. Peer assessment can happen among the different bodies within the system. And then finally, if there's a need for recognition of all of those outcomes of conformity assessment, one of the mechanisms that can be used is a multilateral arrangement. Okay, so we've got the terms out of the way. Let's move on to how we got to where we are. And it really is about building trust in those conformity assessment results. Conformity assessment's done every second of every day on millions of different objects against an even larger number of specified requirements. If you think about the computer that you're using or the mobile device that you're using today, there are multiple components in there that represent thousands of requirements in many, many standards. And there are different types of conformity assessment done to ensure that those products meet the requirements. Among those requirements being that they interoperate well enough for you to receive the signal that is broadcasting the webinar. And so it's a huge, huge amount of activity that happens in the background. And so there has to be a lot of trust in the outcomes of those conformity assessments because there's no way anybody could continue to repeat all of those conformity assessments in most cases. So when you think about, and as this system has evolved, it really distilled out over the years to 3 critical characteristics of those conformity assessment bodies, CABs, that support trust in the outcome of that conformity assessment. One is competence. Do they know what they're doing? If it is an organization that is certifying a person for their competence to perform a task or to their knowledge around a given subject area, the organization evaluating that person should have the right competence to do so. If it's a testing organization, do they understand the nature of the samples they're testing, and are they competent to perform that test? If they're certifying a product, do they have the competence not only to look at the data related to a product, but potentially extend that data to make a certification on products that are being produced over time? Competence at the core of having confidence in the outcome of the conformity assessment process. Next is impartiality. Are the decisions and are the outcomes of the conformity assessment based only on the data and the process involved? In other words, there are no other effects to the decisions that are made, the process that's used, and the outcome can be trusted as being the result of a process and not any other influences on the conformity assessment. Finally, is the process consistent? If it were done multiple times, would the outcome be comparable? Whether that's being done within the organization, across organizations, or around the world. Do they know what they're doing? Do they perform conformity assessment impartially? And do they have a consistency to their operation? So as this system evolved, stakeholders then decided, there are standards for everything. There are lots of standards organizations, hundreds of them just in the US alone. So there are systems that have evolved to bring standards developers together, but in many areas of conformity assessment, they actually coalesced around a common set of standards for conformity assessment bodies and how they operate, so that there's a trust in the results. If you know that the testing laboratory or inspection body is competent, impartial, and consistent based on the same standard here in the US as they use in Canada or Germany or China, then that at least provides the trust that the outcome is the same or similar. And when similar standards are used for the objects of conformity assessment, that can ultimately lead to some real benefits in terms of global trade and acceptance. So where are these standards coming from? They're published by ISO, the International Organization for Standardization, from the timeline, in their Committee for Conformity Assessment, CASCO. So we don't have time to go through the whole ISO structure, but CASCO is that organization that publishes the standards that we use for accreditation of conformity assessment bodies and conformity assessment body acceptance outside the accreditation system. Most of them are developed jointly with the International Electrotechnical Commission, IEC, so you'll see the titles with an ISO/IEC. These aren't the only standards that are developed jointly with IEC, but they're particularly given a designation as the ISO IEC 17000 series. And so if you are on the webinar and you're from a laboratory that's accredited or not accredited, the relevant standard would be 17025. If you are in a person certification body, it would be 17024 and so on. And because these collective standards are used to facilitate acceptance of conformity assessment, they're the tools that we have, and they're referred to as the CASCO toolbox. And this is really important because this collection of standards then allows stakeholders, whether it's regulators, whether it's industry, whether it's other organizations, to have a common basis for comparing the conformity assessment bodies. This is the whole toolbox. Now you can see this is lots and lots of standards for lots and lots of things. Some of these are for the accreditation process. Some of these relate to conformity assessment bodies. And so as I said earlier, I don't have time in today's webinar to go into the specifics, but there are some commonalities to these standards. For conformity assessment bodies, whether it's testing, inspection, certification, validation, and verification, they all address in an appropriate way for that type of conformity assessment, competence, impartiality, and consistency. So we have the standards that we can use as the tools for the basis for recognizing the outcomes of conformity assessment. We can look at the competencies of these different types of conformity assessment bodies in a consistent way. Well, so what? What good is that? Well, there's lots of different ways that a conformity assessment body can demonstrate they meet the standards. Those standards in the toolbox are written in a way that a conformity assessment body itself can follow it and never get accredited. They can declare to their customers that they operate in accordance with the relevant Casco toolbox standard. So if it's an inspection body, they can get ISO IEC 17020, assess themselves against that standard, and declare to their customers they meet the requirements. And that's a perfectly valid use of that ISO standard. However, some people may want more confidence than that. If they're purchasing the services, maybe that second party that's going to be the customer of the inspection agency wants to do their own evaluation against those requirements. In lots of cases, before even the timeline that I shared with you started, regulators have been in the business of looking at the conformity assessment bodies, particularly that do testing and inspection, for a very long time. They may want to have confidence that a conformity assessment body can be used to test products that they regulate, or inspect products that are coming into the country, or certify products for their safety. So regulators can have a role in evaluating conformity assessment bodies. We mentioned peer evaluation, and that's a whole different subject for peer evaluation of conformity assessment bodies in a different global system. That could be another webinar. What we're focusing on today is when that recognition of the conformity assessment body's competence, the evaluation of their competence, impartiality, and consistent operation is done by an independent third party with the authority to do so, and that's an accreditation body. So recognize there's a whole lot of conformity assessment that happens in the US and abroad that's not necessarily subject to accreditation. However, we're going to focus on that because that's the system that's evolved to make it easier for purchasers of conformity assessment services or regulators or peers to accept the competence, impartiality, and consistent operation of conformity assessment bodies without having to do that themselves. So how does that work? The accreditation body is also operating against one of those Casco standards. And so regulators, private sector organizations, or regional cooperation bodies may be evaluating the accreditation bodies. We're going to focus on that last one in this global system that builds from regions of the world up through an international acceptance of the accreditations that are performed. And so when we look at how this system has evolved, it started regionally and eventually developed into global arrangements among accreditation bodies to facilitate the acceptance of conformity assessment and ultimately minimize the need to do conformity assessment more than once. So let's talk about those regional cooperation bodies. The purpose is to manage the mutual recognition arrangements among the accreditation bodies and perform peer evaluations. So how do they do that? What's it all about? If you are on the webinar and you are in a conformity assessment body that's accredited, you know that your accreditation body comes and assesses you periodically to ensure that you continue to meet relevant requirements. These regional cooperation bodies are evaluating accreditation bodies in a very similar process. Trained evaluators who have expertise in accreditation and technical areas covered by the accreditation body will come into the accreditation body and evaluate how they accredit. If that accreditation body successfully completes that peer evaluation, has been demonstrated to meet the relevant requirements, and is accepted into the arrangement, they sign a mutual recognition arrangement among those ABs in the region. So when you see one of the insider terms that you see when you refer to the credentials of an accreditation body is that they're a signatory to a given international arrangement. There are members of these arrangements that are not signatories. They may be pursuing recognition as an accreditation body. Some of these regions also accept stakeholders as members, but signatory accreditation bodies are those that have been peer evaluated and demonstrated that they meet the relevant requirements. A very critical point is that while some of these regional cooperation bodies have direct relationships or connections to regional institutions. For example, the European Cooperation for Accreditation that I'll talk about in a minute is related to the European Commission. In the Asia Pacific region, there's a connection to APEC. So when those organizations interact, there is sometimes coordination of objectives and work that's done in the region. However, all of these regional bodies that are being discussed as I go forward are not intergovernmental agreements. They're not treaty organizations. The agreements themselves are among accreditation bodies. Governments often leverage those arrangements as a means for ensuring that accreditation bodies are competent. However, there's no formal obligation of governments to do so. We in ANAB and across the world work closely with regulators to ensure that they leverage the system that already exists, but it is not among the member governments, it's among the member accreditation bodies. And these regional cooperation bodies cover all types of conformity assessment, whether it's all of the examples that we gave earlier, testing, inspection, certification, validation, verification. As of today, there's 6. And if you look at this, and I'll show a map of the world in a moment with their locations, there are 2 that are located in Africa, 1 in the Arab countries, 1 that covers the Asia Pacific, 1 for Europe, and 1 for the Americas. Initially, there were only 2, the European and the Asia Pacific regions that established the global recognition organizations. But through time, we've added all of the regions that we've got here through the years, and recognizing that there's more accreditation and more conformity assessment affecting our globally connected markets. So we've got the regions. They do the hard work of evaluating the accreditation bodies. The accreditation bodies are accrediting CABs. Conformity assessment bodies are evaluating objects of conformity assessment. Sort of at the top of this pyramid are currently two global arrangements intended to facilitate global acceptance of conformity assessment results beyond the regions, across the world. The purpose is to recognize those regional cooperation bodies. That next layer down conducts the evaluation of accreditation bodies. So this is another set of eyes looking at what goes on. The global arrangements look at the regions look at the accreditation bodies look at the conformity assessment bodies, the conformity assessment bodies look at the objects of conformity assessment. Now, I'm going to do this visually for you in a minute. To make this all work, in addition to the ISO Casco toolbox standards that I talked about earlier, there are additional policies and requirements for how that peer evaluation process is done at the regional level, as well as some requirements for how accreditation bodies operate and how they look at the accreditation of their conformity assessment bodies. Now, this is also among the accreditation bodies. So even at this global level, the arrangement itself is among the accreditors, not among the respective governments. But critical to this, ANAB as a signatory and other signatory accreditation bodies have a number of obligations. We agree to accept the results of each other's accredited conformity assessment bodies. We as the accreditors go through the peer evaluation process and trust each other's outcomes so that we don't have to repeat accreditation, so that the conformity assessment can ideally only be done once, and we can facilitate trade and acceptance of those results. The two arrangements as they exist today are the International Accreditation Forum. As you can see, the types of accreditation that are covered by IAF are certification bodies. So management systems, products, processes, services, personnel, as well as validation and verification bodies. The International Laboratory Accreditation Cooperation, ILAC, covers the rest. So laboratories that do testing, calibration, or medical testing, inspection bodies, as well as proficiency testing providers and reference material producers. Now, we are at another point that will go on that timeline if we were to do this presentation in the near future, because these two organizations are in the process of establishing a single global organization to cover all accreditation. That should be happening ideally in the next year or so, and so stay tuned. There will be one global organization at the top of this pyramid. So this is the representation of where they are around the world. I took some liberties with drawing the circles just because the geographic boundaries on here are difficult to capture. So don't hold me to the exact placement of the lines, but I do want to recognize one thing that's unique to the United States. We sit in the Americas as well as the Asia Pacific. And so that overlap in the rings for APAC, the Asia Pacific Accreditation Cooperation, and the IAC, that's intentional, because that means that indicates that there are some accreditation bodies in the US that are participants in both regions and are going through joint evaluations to get their recognition to be part of the global ILAC and IAF arrangements. Okay, so we're close to the end of the webinar. I know there's a lot of stuff, a lot of detail, so I'm going to try and build this from the ground up, and then we'll open it up for your questions to help in cracking this code. So we'll start with the objects of conformity assessment. So again, it could be a product, a process, a service, a system, installation, organizations. It could be the management system for a company, whether it's an ISO 9001 or their environmental management system or their information security management system. It could be the specifications for a product. It could be the competency requirements for a person. That object of conformity assessment's at the core of all of this. Conformity assessment bodies are looking at those objects of conformity assessment, sometimes literally, or sometimes doing auditing or inspection, testing, all of those activities of conformity assessment. Those conformity assessment bodies operate in accordance with those Casco toolbox standards that I talked about. So if they're doing inspection, it would be ISO IEC 17020. If they're doing product certification, ISO IEC 17065. That common set of standards for how the conformity assessment is done, regardless of the requirements for that object of conformity assessment, is the basis for this global acceptance. Conformity assessment body assesses conformity with the specified requirements and generates results. Those results need to be trusted. And so if there's an interest in a given sector, in a given country, by a regulator or a private sector entity, the next layer that can be added on to provide confidence would be accreditation. The accreditation body is independent of the conformity assessment bodies. They have authority given to them to accredit, and they have their own standard to operate against, which is ISO IEC 17011, as well as the additional requirements that come from the regional and global organizations that recognize them, and other users. Scheme owners is a term we use in conformity assessment when there are additions to 17011 to ensure that the accreditation process addresses specific needs of the users of that accreditation. So the accreditation body is looking at the conformity assessment body. Are they meeting the relevant ISO IEC 17000 series standard? And are they competent, impartial, and consistently operating? Now, when an accreditation body looks at the conformity assessment body, they don't specifically have an interest in the conformity assessment body's outcomes related to the object of conformity assessment. If an accreditation body is assessing a test lab, they don't really have any interest in whether or not a particular test passes or fails, where the results land. What the accreditation body is looking at is whether that test was done competently and what systems are in place to ensure that the conformity assessment is impartial and does their conformity assessment consistently. So the accreditation body watches the CAB. The CAB is evaluating the object of conformity assessment. At the next level up are the regional cooperation bodies. We talked about them earlier. They operate in accordance with requirements from the global organizations. They conduct a peer evaluation of the accreditation body. They're looking at the accreditation body's competence, impartiality, and consistent operation, but their interest is a little different. These regional cooperations are among accreditors, and so they need to trust the outcomes of the accreditation body's decisions. If you're evaluating your peer in the Asia Pacific region, would you come to a similar conclusion on the competence of the conformity assessment body that accreditation body that you're evaluating is the decision that they would reach? So this is part of a process of evaluation. So the regional cooperation bodies will come and evaluate the accreditation body. Part of that is watching them assess the conformity assessment body, and part of that would be witnessing how the conformity assessment body does conformity assessment. Now, when these evaluations happen, there are big teams, and this becomes multiple levels of people watching other people, each of them with their own specific objectives. The peer evaluators don't necessarily need to have any interest in the conformity assessment body and their competence. So in other words, if I'm evaluating an accreditation body, they're doing an initial assessment of a conformity assessment body, there may be multiple issues in their conformity with the requirements. However, I'm interested in the process the accreditation body uses to identify those issues and then ultimately evaluate whether the corrective actions put in place are appropriate. So the regional cooperation bodies evaluate the accreditors. The accreditors assess and accredit the conformity assessment bodies who are looking at the objects of conformity assessment. Now that's happening in different parts of the world. To make it all fit together, at the top of the pyramid are these global arrangements, IAF and ILAC. They have their own requirements, and that's a last set of eyes. They watch how the regions perform their evaluations of the accreditors. And so in a single evaluation, you could have multiple people watching all of these different levels. One of the first experiences I had, I worked for an accreditation body. I was witnessing the assessment of a laboratory. The laboratory was calibrating thermometers. There was somebody watching me from the Asia Pacific, watching my assessor assess the conformity assessment body as they calibrated. There was somebody from the global arrangement watching the person from the Asia Pacific region, watching me, watching the assessor, watching the calibration being done. That seems like an awful lot of investment, but think about the critical nature of conformity assessment and results, and you'll recognize that particularly in areas where products are of a high level of risk and where there's significant costs involved in the trade of those products and the need for them to be meeting the requirements across the globe, you can see how this system becomes really important in providing that level of confidence. So I'm going to wrap up with a couple of different pieces of information. First, this is showing you that we have multiple accreditation bodies in the US that fit into that puzzle of regional and global organizations differently. Some are only involved in testing or the kind of conformity assessment that's covered by ILAC. Some only do conformity assessment that's covered by IAF, and ANAB and others are involved in multiple across the different organizations. Okay, last slide. Why do we do all this? And it really, as I started out, it was because there was a need to develop trust and acceptance of conformity assessment around the world. If you're going to be exporting a product to multiple countries, you don't want to have to test it multiple times. You'd ultimately like to have it tested or certified here in the US and have it accepted all over. If you are operating a management system in accordance with ISO 9001, it's much more beneficial to have that evaluated, assessed, audited once, have that certification of your management system accepted around the globe. If these systems work properly, then it minimizes the need for repeating that conformity assessment. You don't have to do it in every country because there's this global system of acceptance among the accreditation bodies and the related stakeholders. And that can and should facilitate trade. It reduces the cost associated with the conformity assessment, the cost of the goods, and then allows for that trade of products, processes, and services without having to do more conformity assessment. One of the key ways that we use these arrangements is to leverage that infrastructure for both governments and private sector organizations. Think about all of the work that went into those various steps in that last slide and the different layers. If organizations in government or the private sector want to have confidence in conformity assessment, they can rely on use of those arrangements to ensure that accreditation bodies are competent and that they can trust the conformity assessment results from the accredited conformity assessment bodies. They may specify in regulation or in contractual documents that the conformity assessment results have to come from a conformity assessment body that's accredited by a signatory to the relevant arrangements. That brings with it all of that infrastructure and then allows those entities to perhaps focus on additional specific issues that they may have in regulating a product or ensuring that the objects of conformity assessment that they're procuring are meeting their specific needs. Another benefit is that it's created a global community for conformity assessment and accreditation. So as needs change, as the products and services that are being developed evolve so rapidly as they are today, that the accreditation community, the conformity assessment bodies that are part of that system are able to interact and ensure that the organizations are meeting those changing needs and that the standards for the operation of conformity assessment bodies and accreditation bodies is evolving. And then finally, this is just one part of the global quality infrastructure that engages in developing standards in areas of technical measurement, providing the traceable metrology that supports the comparability of those measurements to ensure ultimately that we're supporting health, safety, and environment and the quality of life. That's why I've made most of my career doing accreditation, because it really has an impact. And even though it's very complicated and the use of the standards is something that is not always transparent, the systems that have been put in place have allowed for just tremendous innovation and interoperability of systems around the world, allowing for us to have the economic benefits that we have seen over the last several decades and come together as a community and overcome challenges like the pandemic and other global challenges that we see. With that, I'll stop talking for a minute, and David, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you, Warren. I appreciate that. There have been a number of questions that have come up in the chat, and what we'd like you to know is that this webinar is being recorded. It will be available for you to access after this webinar is over. Warren, there are several questions directed towards you. The first is, can an accreditation body have a global agreement directly, or does it always have to first have an agreement through regional cooperations?
It's an excellent question. And under the system, if there is access to a region, then the accreditation body is required to go through the region. And that's because the global arrangement is really not, it's set up to evaluate the regions rather than individual ABs. Now, there are mechanisms in place for the rare situations where there may be an accreditation body in a country that is not technically within one of the recognized regional cooperations, and then ILAC or IAF itself would perform the evaluation. But generally speaking, the most common path to that global recognition is through one of the regions.
Okay. Another question, Warren, is I'm at a CRO. I would like to know what ISO certification a CRO can apply for since we are only doing research projects.
Interesting. I think it depends on the type of research, but I think there are multiple different types of uh, different standards within the Casco toolbox that could apply. So if it's research that involves analytical techniques, so making measurements, um, pharmaceutical research or research related to the chemical industry, academic institutions, there is still the possibility for um, pursuing accreditation as a laboratory under ISO IEC 17025. Now, if you have different systems in place within your organization, you may also pursue certification of your management system to an appropriate ISO management system standard. ISO 9001 can be applied in a number of different settings, as well as if you're looking at information security or the environmental impact of your organization, those management system certifications might also be relevant. And if the individual wants to follow up specifically, I think it really would depend on the type of research and the type of environment of the organization, and we'd be happy to provide more information on that.
Thank you, Warren. There's another question. You mentioned the regional groups. Do these occasionally overlap, and do they also occasionally conflict with each other?
That's a very interesting question. So the overlap can occur in membership. I had mentioned that in the United States, we have um, accreditation bodies that participate both in the Asia Pacific region as well as the Inter-American region. And so when that happens, the evaluations are performed jointly. And because both of the regions are implementing recognition processes based on the requirements that are established at the global level, so by ILAC and IAF, the two evaluation processes are similar. They may not be identical. There should not be a situation where there would be conflicting practices between the two. If there are, then there is the opportunity to take that issue to the relevant committees within ILAC or IAF and have the issues addressed at the global level to promote harmonization.
There's one more question in the chat here. You mentioned peer assessment amongst accreditation bodies. Because of this concept of peer assessment, does this also mean that laboratories can assess each other in the same manner?
Sure. And the short answer is yes, it can happen. And the standards, the Casco Toolbox standards, and we're talking about laboratories here, so 17,025, is written in a way that it can be incorporated by a first, second, or third party. And so the laboratory um, can demonstrate by itself, or there can definitely be a system of peer assessment to among laboratories to 17,025. there are different schemes globally that will be based upon a peer assessment process particularly when the conformity assessment bodies are accepting the outcomes from their peer conformity assessment bodies. The one thing that I'll mention with laboratories in particular, oftentimes it's difficult to perform those assessments and have the competence to determine full conformity with 17025. And in those cases, often stakeholders will then require accreditation as a means for demonstrating that.
Okay. A couple more questions have come in. Warren, if you hold a certificate in 17025 through ANAB, is that internationally recognized by other regional groups like the EA, or do you need to seek additional certification by an accreditation body for the equivalent of 17025 in the EA?
Excellent question. So one of the benefits of using these international standards like 17025 is that in Europe and here in the US and in all of the regions, we assess laboratories in this case against those same requirements. And based on these mutual recognition arrangements, that 17025 accreditation from ANAB should be accepted by the accreditation bodies in other regions like EA as being equivalent to those that they issue themselves. Now, where it gets tricky, not just in Europe or other parts of the world, but even here in the United States, is then looking at the specific requirements for the accreditation. So two things come to mind. One is what tests or calibrations are on that scope on the scope of accreditation. So the scope itself should be accepted, but there may be requirements in Europe or the United States, it happens quite frequently, for specific methods to be on the scope. And so that's one area where there could be difference in the acceptance of the accreditation. The other may be regulatory requirements. We have some in the United States that specifically state that the accreditation has to be performed by an accreditation body in the US. And there may be regulatory regimes in other regions or areas of the world that are similar. And so under these mutual recognition arrangements, there's definitely an obligation among the accreditation bodies for acceptance. But then those that leverage the use of these arrangements may have different expectations and requirements. And so if there is a laboratory that's accredited by ANAB and has specific questions around acceptance of their accreditation, please contact us and we'd be happy to go through those specifics with you and ensure that you've got the most appropriate information.
Perfect. Warren, let's have time for one more question. Our standard for veterinary diagnostic lab accreditation has been written to be 97% the same as ISO 17025. Is there any opportunity to be assessed and recognized under our own standard?
That's a really interesting question. The short answer, I'll give you two answers to that. One is that it's entirely possible to be assessed to that standard. There's also a standard that's been aligned with 17025 for medical testing laboratories, 15189. That standard has actually been accepted in these regional and global arrangements. And so not only could you be assessed and accredited to that standard, it would be accepted under the MRA. I'm not familiar with the veterinary diagnostic standard, but I'm pretty certain it has not been included at this stage in any of these regional or global arrangements. And so you could be assessed and have that standard potentially referenced on your scope of accreditation, but that may be outside of this global recognition system. In other words, it may not be accepted the same way that a 17025 accreditation is.
Okay. Warren, thank you very much. I think that concludes our question and answer session. If you have questions, there you can send them to myself, David Feist, dfeist@anab.org. Um, Thank you very much for your attendance. You have our contact information in front of you. Uh, if you have any further questions, uh, please send them to these email addresses. Warren, any final comments?
No, I just thank everyone for attending. I hope this was useful. If you have any questions, I would be more than happy to spend time with any of the participants to go through this information in more depth.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.